school bullying has reportedly increased under President Trump. The Trump DOJ narrowed the definition of domestic violence to only physical aggression in 2019, ruling out psychological aggression. The Trump administration has not reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, which had been partially credited for a 60% drop in reports of intimate partner violence from 1996 to 2010. COVID-19 has been a stressor, a destroyer, and a growth challenge. The hidden pandemic of intimate partner violence has been exacerbated. Reports on calls to hotlines are mixed. There are reports of increased calls and others reporting a 50% drop, likely due to the difficulty of making private calls during isolation. And it's hard to find substantial data on actual violence, but experts are expecting a significant increase in IPV and homicide because disasters in the past have exacerbated violence, and COVID underscores risk factors for domestic violence. Moreover, these risk factors are much worse for marginalized communities, so outcomes for domestic violence will likely be worse for minority communities, just as outcomes for other physical and mental health challenges are worse in the BIPOC communities. Isolation increases opportunity for psychological aggression, control, and coercion. Financial stresses are a known risk factor for domestic violence. Psychological stress is also a risk factor for domestic violence. There was an uptick in IPV during Hurricane Harvey, for example. 1 in 3 women and, as mentioned, 1 in 10 men experience spousal abuse in their lifetime, and IPV cuts across all ethnic categories. Of course, men have to be held accountable for aggression against women, and violence is totally unacceptable. But we also have to create space for men to come to terms with their own inner lives and emotions and their own histories of childhood trauma and abuse. Racism has disempowered and devalued BIPOC men in America, and this is an added psychological stress. We have to deconstruct racism, even as we deconstruct masculine entitlement to power. But men have emotions and are vulnerable, and the culture has not seen this. Psychologists have pointed to a friendship crisis among men, and men are often more isolated relationally than women. Less relational experience leads to worse understanding of how mutual relationships work. Anecdotally, the pandemic seems to be shifting the environment around men, allowing them more room for vulnerability and relationship. As a psychiatrist and humanist, I hope that we can all work to create an equitable society where all have access to the all-important human journeys of identity, belonging, and wellness.
First, I want to remind everyone that the first step for the criminal process to be triggered is when the police is called. It's oftentimes by the DV victim, but sometimes by a witness like a neighbor to a DV incident. Even in the midst of shelter in place, as Sunita mentioned, victims are still able to call the police to seek help, and criminal cases are still being filed and heard in criminal court. And that's because the police, the DA's office, and criminal courts are essential services that have been allowed to remain open. And that's been true here in Santa Clara County. Our criminal courts handling family violence cases have been open every day during shelter in place. Some types of hearings were initially delayed during the first few months of shutdown, including jury trials. Now, these were hearings that involved coordinating with more people like victims and witnesses. However, even these hearings have since resumed their pre-pandemic pace here in Santa Clara County. Note, though, that court functions do look different now than they did prior to shelter in place, and they've changed depending on how restrictive the public health orders have been in response to the rising COVID-19 numbers in our community. So, for example, this week, in response to the surge in COVID-19 cases in our county, our Superior Court issued a new order that restricts the number of people or the types of parties that are allowed to even come into the courthouse. So for criminal court, the defendants, as well as the attorneys on both sides, and only witnesses and victims, including DV victims, that have been subpoenaed for court, and that's the court order that requires them to show up for court. Their victim advocates can come as well as parents of minor victims may also appear. If DV victims go to court under subpoena, The same COVID-19 restrictions that you see elsewhere apply, including screening at the front so that you can't enter if you have COVID-19 symptoms, have to wear a mask, and practice social distancing. So for other hearings, the victims and the public at large may not attend in person. However, some courts, including here in Santa Clara County, have created options for victims to appear remotely if they aren't able to appear in person. The first is through video calls in the same way that we're doing here through Zooms or through Microsoft Teams. Courts are allowing victims to appear via the remote link. So for example, if the victim wants to provide input about the type of protective order that they want the court to issue, or if the victim wants to speak at the defendant's sentencing and tell the court about what he or she thinks should happen to the case, then they can do so via these remote links. The other option is through telephone, and that's through, here in Santa Clara County, we have public access telephone lines. Every court department has a number that the victim or the public can call into if they just want to listen into the proceedings in the same way in the past if you would just come to court and sit in the gallery and observe. Prosecutors and victim advocates from our DA's office, Victim Services Unit, have continued to be in touch with victims, meeting in person as needed and following all safety protocols, including mask and social distancing. And though we've also shifted to meeting virtually as well. Our Victim Services Unit is essentially a crime victim's connection to prosecutor, law enforcement, and our advocates also help victims have a voice in the criminal justice process because we know it can be very intimidating. Victim advocates can assist DV victims with applying for reimbursement for medical expenses and counseling, emergency assistance like finding emergency shelter, crisis support, and safety planning. Here in Santa Clara County, our DA's office, Victim Services Unit, have multiple language capabilities. In addition to English, we have Spanish, Vietnamese, Mandarin Chinese, and Russian speaking capabilities. We also have access to the language access line, where a third-party service provider assists over the phone for other languages that we don't have sort of direct support for. I remind people about the generational impact of domestic violence, right? About how children who grow up witnessing abuse oftentimes become perpetrators or victims themselves. And so they want to break that cycle of generational violence. It's so difficult, but it's so important to seek help, if not from the police, because I know there's so many barriers to even being to connect with the police, but from DV service providers, nonprofits. In our county, we have amazing nonprofits who are so connected and embedded in our communities, right? And there's these amazing networks of survivors who are supporting one another, helping them find jobs, right? Or helping them have a place to stay. And so it's so hard, but we're never going to break the cycle of violence if we don't speak up and speak.
Right? And so in terms of the civil restraining orders, there are different types of restraining orders. So the first one, domestic violence, that means that the person requesting the restraining order has to have a relationship that falls under Family Code 6211. So that means first degree or second degree familial relationship or dating relationship, intimate partner. So that would fall under domestic violence. Now, if it's a relationship outside of that, so there's a table of consanguinity I can send out also so you know which relationships fall under which. But outside of a dating relationship or a close family relationship, it would be considered civil harassment. And so that could be, for instance, a neighbor, a coworker, or niece or nephew. So with the protections are a little bit different. In the domestic violence restraining orders, there are orders also for custody and visitation, if that's applicable. There's requests for move-out orders, whereas in civil harassment, there would not be support orders or custody and visitation orders. Another type of civil restraining order will be an elder abuse or a dependent adult. So someone 65 or older could come to court and seek protection from being physically abused, financially, mentally, or emotionally abused, neglected, abandoned, isolated, or deprived by a caregiver of services to avoid harm or suffering. So because of the restrictions with the pandemic and everything, what was really important for our court is to remain open the whole time of the shelter in place for victims of domestic violence to come in and seek in-person assistance. For all other non-emergency issues, the court changed the self-help services to remote. So we would answer the phone lives, we have live chat, we have remote video conferencing. We continue to offer day of court services, but remotely, but we wanted to make sure that for victims of domestic violence, for people that needed emergency custody visitation, emergency guardianship issues, or nowadays with the evictions, kind of being an emergency because of the pandemic and the different rules, the litigants can come in directly to the court to get services. So to give you an idea, when the customer comes in, and we call them customers, I should say, because although I'm an attorney, I work for the court, we help both sides, right? So we will help the person seeking the assistance and then also the person who wants to respond to their restraining order. So we'll help, and in a neutral way, provide legal information, but not legal advice. So we can explain the law, tell them what to expect, but we're not going to be representing them in court. It's very different from a traditional attorney-client relationship. Yes, they can come in person. They can access our resources that way. And then we help them through their declaration to understand how to present the information to the court, because it's just a written declaration. There's not necessarily the opportunity to present evidence per se, but they can definitely include text messages or pictures, things like that. But what's really important in the declaration is to paint a clear picture for the judicial officer who's going to grant this temporary order within 24 to 48 hours. So it's a really quick turnaround time for the restraining orders, temporary restraining orders.
So when shelter in place first began, we did have a lot of barriers to accessing the court in the beginning. Mostly it was for unrepresented litigants, which means people that don't have an attorney and people who do not speak English. So for them to access the Access Center or court services and obtain any advice or any help or information or paperwork, they had to speak English in order to access those services, because the phone number, the voicemail, and the individual who answered the phone was only an English-speaking individual. So those were barriers to access. In addition, there's just been significant delays. Everything takes longer. Court hearings were pushed out significantly. DV survivors don't just need protection in the form of restraining orders. I also represent survivors of domestic violence in their divorce cases, child custody cases, child support cases, and immigration cases, certain immigration cases related to domestic violence survivors, affirmative cases only. And in some of those instances, a survivor might need access to income or finances, might need an enforcement motion, and courts were not hearing all of those matters. So a lot of survivors were delayed in receiving any adjudication on their cases. Some are still waiting today, and some, we believe, who didn't have attorneys maybe stopped trying to access services. If they didn't have an attorney helping them, the barriers were insurmountable, and we don't know how many people are without help and services because they didn't even know how to access it. And I think there's just a very important distinction to be made for people who have attorneys and people who don't have attorneys. I think other ways in which the court system and law enforcement, in my opinion, have been failing survivors is we don't have adequate implicit bias training for bench officers. We don't have adequate implicit bias training for officers that respond to the scene in domestic violence cases. I think it's really important for there to be this kind of mandatory training for judicial officers and for all police officers. Culturally sensitive responses to survivors of domestic violence is critical. Some people who are undocumented are, of course, not going to feel comfortable sharing the details. Some individuals from different cultures are comfortable sharing details in a different manner than in another culture. And I think that the bias that survivors encounter when they enter the courtroom is significant and affects everyone's case. That's a long-term issue. That's not specifically a COVID issue, but it is significant, ongoing, and I think progress needs to be made if we really are going to help survivors of domestic violence in the community. I have to be honest, most of my cases are not prosecuted. My clients file police reports and no prosecution is ever pursued. My clients typically don't end up feeling that they have the support from the police department when they report TRO violations or when they report domestic violence incidents and are seeking enforcement of some kind, whether that be removing the abuser from the household, an arrest, or a criminal case if that's what they're choosing. My clients don't typically report responsiveness from the police department in those respects. So those are challenges that I think we're seeing in terms of accountability.